The United Nations has warned that the world is facing its largest humanitarian crisis since the end of the Second World War, with nearly 20 million people at risk of starvation in Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, and Yemen. The UN's humanitarian chief, Stephen O'Brien, told the UN Security Council Friday that $4.4 billion is needed by July to avert a famine.
We stand at a critical point in our history. Already at the beginning of the year, we are facing the largest humanitarian crisis since the creation of the United Nations. Now, more than 20 million people across 4 countries face starvation and famine. Without collective and coordinated global efforts, people will simply starve to death. All 4 countries have one thing in common: conflict. This means that we, you, have the possibility to prevent and end further misery and suffering. The UN and its partners are ready to scale up, but we need the access and the funds to do more. It is all preventable. It is possible to avert this crisis, to avert these famines, to avert these looming human catastrophes.
Last month, the UN declared a famine in parts of South Sudan, but O'Brien said the biggest crisis is in Yemen. Earlier this week, aid officials said they're in a race against time to prevent a famine brought on by a U.S.-backed Saudi-led war and blockade. Almost 19 million people in Yemen, 2/3 of the total population, are in need of assistance, and more than 7 million are facing starvation, an increase of 3 million since January. The executive director of the World Food Program said her agency had just 3 months' worth of food stored and that officials were only able to provide hungry Yemenis with about 1/3 of the rations they need. This all comes as the Trump administration is seeking billions of dollars in cuts in funding to the United Nations. To talk more about the crisis, we're joined by Joel Charney, director of the Norwegian Refugee Council USA. Joel, thanks so much for joining us. Can you talk about this worst humanitarian crisis since World War II?
Well, Stephen O'Brien described it very well. In 4 countries, because of conflict, only in 1 case, Somalia, do we have drought, which is also driving the deprivation. But in Yemen, Somalia, South Sudan, and northern Nigeria, millions of people are on the brink of famine, largely because of the disruption of food production, the inability of aid agencies to get in, and just ongoing conflict, which is making life a misery for millions of people.
So let's start with Yemen, Joel. I mean, you have the picture of President Trump yesterday sitting with the Saudi leader in the White House. The war that's taking place in Yemen, the Saudi bombing backed by the United States. Can you talk about the effect this has had on the population?
It's been a relentless war with violations of international humanitarian law by the Saudis and the coalition that they're a part of, as well as by the Houthis that are resisting the Saudi assault. And from the beginning of the bombing, I mean, I vividly remember when the bombing first started, within the space of a couple weeks, the warehouses and office buildings of 3 or 4 non-governmental organizations working in Yemen were hit by the Saudi assault. And what's happened, Yemen imports 90% of its food, even in normal times. So this is not so much a disruption of food production, but it's a disruption of commerce due to the bombing, due to the blockade, due to the movement of the National Bank from Sana'a down to Aden. And taken all together, it's just creating an impossible situation in a country that's completely dependent on food imports for its survival.